You need to leave. Right now. Before he sees you talking to me. The woman who whispered those words, Priya, a coworker I'd known for 3 years, had never looked at me like that before. There was something in her eyes that didn't match the upbeat charity gala happening 10 feet away from us. It wasn't worry. It was closer to real fear. The kind that sits quietly behind a person's face when they've already calculated what could go wrong. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but she was already stepping back, straightening her posture, lifting her champagne glass like none of that had just happened, like she hadn't just grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a mark. I stood there for a second, alone near the coat check in the back corridor of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, and tried to figure out what exactly I'd walked into. The event was for a children's hospital foundation, one of those polished, expensive evenings where everyone wore things they'd probably never wear again and smiled at people they didn't know. I worked in nonprofit development. Events like this were technically my entire job. I'd arrived early to confirm table arrangements, run through the program schedule with the venue coordinator, and make sure the donor acknowledgement boards were properly positioned near the entrance. Standard Tuesday night work. Just informal wear. I had not expected Priya's warning, and I had definitely not expected what happened 30 seconds later. The room shifted. That's the only way I can describe it. Not the furniture, not the lighting. Those stayed exactly the same. But the feeling of the room changed. The way a sky changes right before a storm rolls in. Conversations didn't stop, but they softened. Movement near the main entrance slowed almost imperceptibly. Even the 2 wait staff who'd been crossing the floor with trays paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing as if they hadn't noticed anything at all. I turned to look. There were 4 of them at first, men in dark suits, positioned with the kind of casual deliberateness that doesn't happen by accident. Not security guards, not exactly. They held no visible earpieces, carried no clipboards. They simply occupied the space in a way that made it clear the space now belonged to someone else. And then he walked in. He wasn't the tallest person in the room, and he wasn't the loudest. Actually, he said nothing at all for a long moment, just stood at the entrance and let his eyes move slowly across the hall with the unhurried patience of someone who has never once had to rush. He wore a black suit that fit like it had been made specifically for him, which it probably had. His shirt collar was open 1 button lower than everyone else's, and along the left side of his neck, visible just above the fabric, was the edge of something inked into his skin. A tattoo that disappeared beneath the collar, intricate and dark. His hair was pushed back from his face. His jaw was set. He looked maybe 30, but carried himself like someone who'd lived considerably longer. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know anything about him. But I watched the room adjust itself around his presence, the way water adjusts around a stone dropped into it. Subtle, immediate, and completely involuntary. The Foundation's executive director, Gerald Marsh, was at the man's side within 40 seconds. Gerald, who routinely kept senators waiting 15 minutes, who had once told a major donor that his table placement was non-negotiable. Gerald moved across that room like he'd been summoned. His body language was different too. Smaller, somehow. More careful. I should have walked the other direction. Priya had essentially told me to. But I was standing near the registration table, and the Foundation director was heading straight toward it, which meant the man beside him was also heading toward me, and there was genuinely nowhere to go without making it obvious. So I did what I always did in uncomfortable situations. I looked down at my clipboard, pretended to review something important, and hoped that the moment would simply pass around me. It didn't. Is there an issue with the table assignments? The voice was quiet. Not low in a theatrical way, just genuinely calm, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it's already certain it will be heard. I looked up. He was closer than I expected. Gerald was hovering slightly behind him, looking like he very much wanted to be somewhere else. No, I said. and was mildly proud that my voice came out even. Everything's confirmed. We have your party at table 2, which is... I know where it is. Not rude, not dismissive, just a statement of fact, delivered without any particular expression. His eyes moved over the room for another moment before coming back to me, and when they did, there was something in them I couldn't immediately name. Not curiosity exactly, more like recognition, which made no sense because I had never seen this man before in my life. "You organized this event," he said. Again, not a question. "I coordinated it, yes. Isabella Reyes from the development office." I shifted my clipboard to my left hand and extended my right, which was a reflex more than anything else. He looked at my hand for just a moment before shaking it. Brief, firm, no performance. His eyes never left my face. "Hakjin," he said. "Just the one name." Gerald cleared his throat from somewhere behind him. "Mr. Yoon has been a longtime supporter of the Foundation. I mentioned that we'd personally... I'll find my table." Hakjin didn't turn when he said it. He just said it, and Gerald stopped talking immediately, as though the sentence had come with a switch. I watched Gerald retreat toward the bar with the energy of a man who had just survived something he'd rather not repeat. I looked back at Hakjin, who was still watching me with that same expression I couldn't quite categorize. "The program starts at 8, I said, because apparently when I'm nervous I default to event logistics. "There's a short reception until then if you..." "Do you always look for something to do with your hands when you're uncomfortable?" I blinked. He glanced briefly at the clipboard I was now holding against my chest like a shield. He wasn't smiling. But something at the edge of his expression had shifted, fractionally. "I'm not uncomfortable," I said, which was a lie so transparent I almost laughed at myself. He didn't respond to that. He just held my gaze for a beat longer than felt natural, then turned and walked toward table 2 without another word, the 4 men in dark suits redistributing themselves around the room as if they'd been choreographed. I exhaled slowly. Behind me, someone touched my elbow. I turned to find Priya again, her champagne glass replaced by a look of concentrated dread. "That's Hakjin Yoon," she said quietly, like his name was something that needed to be handled carefully. "Isabella, please tell me you did not just have a conversation with Hakjin Yoon." "He asked about the table assignments," I said. "I work here, Priya. I couldn't exactly... He doesn't come to events like this." Her voice had dropped even lower. "He never does. Nobody knows why he's here tonight." She paused. "But he was looking at you before he even reached the registration table. I saw him." I turned to glance across the room. Hakjin was seated now, speaking to no one, his posture completely still, one hand resting on the table. But even from 30 feet away, through the movement of 100 other guests, I felt it with sudden and uncomfortable clarity. He was still watching me. I turned back to Priya, and I could feel my pulse doing something I didn't appreciate. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said. She looked at me the way people look at someone who has just said something they will deeply regret later. "Isabella," she said carefully. "People in this city do not say his name out loud without a reason. People cross streets when his car is parked nearby. People leave jobs because their office happened to be 2 floors below one of his businesses." I stared at her. "What are you saying?" She pressed her lips together, chose her next words like she was picking something up off a very thin surface. "I'm saying that I don't know what he wants, but I know that whatever it is, he always gets it." The program music started at the far end of the hall. Guests began moving toward their tables. The room filled with the soft noise of 100 separate conversations, glasses clinking, chairs pulling back against the marble floor. And across all of it, I was entirely certain, without looking, that Hakjin Yoon had not looked away. The rest of the evening should have been routine. I had a program to run. I had a microphone check to confirm with the AV team, a speaker who needed his notes reorganized at the last minute, and a board member who kept approaching me with increasingly minor complaints about the temperature of the room. These were the kinds of things I was good at. Small fires, quiet solutions, problems that dissolved when you paid enough attention to them. I did all of it. I smiled at the right people, redirected the board member toward a warmer spot near the east wall, handed the speaker a printed copy of his revised remarks. I did my job exactly the way I always did, but I kept track of where Hak Jin-yoon was in the room the entire time. Not intentionally, or at least not in a way that felt like a choice. It was more like the awareness was simply there, running underneath everything else, the way you're always aware of a sound that doesn't quite belong, not loud enough to interrupt, but impossible to fully ignore. He didn't move much. That was the thing I noticed. Most people at events like this circulate. They work the room, trade introductions, refill their drinks twice, and their conversation partners 3 times. Hakjin sat at table 2 with the stillness of someone who had no interest in performing for anyone. The men stationed at the perimeter of the room, I'd counted 5 now, not 4, didn't circulate either. They just existed in their positions with a patience that felt practiced. At one point, a man in a gray suit approached Hakjin's table and leaned down to speak to him. I was across the room, near the stage, so I couldn't hear anything. But I watched. Hakjin didn't lean in to meet him. He didn't turn his body toward the conversation. He just listened, completely still, and then said something brief, 4, maybe 5 words. And the man in the gray suit straightened up immediately and walked away with the stiff posture of someone who had just been firmly corrected. That was all. No raised voices. No visible tension. Just 5 words, and the entire exchange was over. I realized I'd been holding my clipboard against my ribs again. Isabella. Marcus from the AV team touched my shoulder. The foundation director wants you at the podium before the remarks start. Right. Yes. I moved. The program went smoothly, the way it usually did when you spent 4 weeks preparing for it. Gerald gave his opening remarks. A pediatric oncologist talked about a research initiative the foundation was funding. A family shared a short, quiet story about their daughter that made half the room go very still. I stood off to the side of the stage and watched it all happen the way I always did. Not as an audience member, but as the person responsible for making sure the audience had what they needed. During the family's remarks, I let my eyes move across the room one more time. Hakjin was watching the stage. His expression hadn't changed, still that same composed, unreadable stillness. But something about the angle of his attention felt different than it had earlier. He wasn't scanning the room anymore. He was just listening to the family speak. His right hand rested flat on the table. He didn't clap along with the polite applause that rose and fell between segments. He just listened. I don't know why that detail stuck with me. It just did. The program wrapped at 9:40. People began collecting their things, saying their goodbyes, grouping near the exits in that slow, social way that means an event is ending, but no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. I started my post-event walkthrough, checking that the donation envelopes had been collected from each table, confirming with the catering manager about leftover arrangements, making sure the foundation's display materials near the entrance would be properly packed. It was during this that I turned a corner near the hallway that led to the private dining rooms and almost walked directly into one of Hakjin's security detail. He was a large man, Korean, probably mid-30s, and he moved to the side to let me pass without a word. I murmured an apology out of reflex and kept going, but I'd only taken 3 steps when I realized there was someone else in that hallway. Hakjin was standing near the far wall, his jacket still perfectly in place, his phone in his hand, though he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me. I stopped. The hallway was quiet. The noise of the reception was muffled back here, distant enough that it felt like a different building entirely. The overhead light was warmer in this corridor, amber rather than the cool white of the main hall, and it made the tattoo along his neck more visible than it had been earlier. dark lines and shapes that I still couldn't fully make out from this distance. "I wasn't following you," I said, which was possibly the least graceful thing I could have opened with. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile. More like the brief acknowledgement that something almost amusing had happened. "I know," he said. I shifted the stack of collection envelopes in my hands and tried to remember that I was a professional adult who had navigated genuinely difficult situations before. "I'm just finishing my walkthrough. The side exit is... Where do you work?" He said it the same way he said everything, without preamble, without softening. "I told you, the Foundation's development office." Before that, I paused. "Excuse me? You're too calm for someone who's been doing this job less than 2 years. He glanced at the envelopes in my hands, then back at my face. "The way you handled the speaker's remarks before the program. You've done that before. More than once. And not here." I didn't know what to do with the fact that he had apparently been watching me closely enough to notice how I handled a last-minute revision to a speaker's notes. I filed that away somewhere uncomfortable. "I worked in hospital administration before this," I said, carefully. "Event coordination was part of it." He nodded once, as if that confirmed something. Then he was quiet for a moment, and in that silence I became very aware that I was alone in a side hallway with a man I knew almost nothing about, except for what Priya had told me. And what Priya had told me was reason enough to be somewhere else. "I should get back," I said. "Gerald will need the final donor count before..." "Gerald left 20 minutes ago." I stopped. He was right. I'd seen Gerald leaving early, something about another engagement, which meant my primary reason for staying was already gone, and the envelopes in my hands were the only thing keeping me tethered to a professional purpose. "Then I should wrap up and head out," I said, adjusting my grip on the envelopes. Hakjin slid his phone into his jacket pocket. He looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and I had the distinct and slightly unnerving feeling that he was making a decision about something. "There's a car waiting at the east entrance," he said finally. "Walk with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a command. It was something in between, a statement delivered with the assumption that what came next was already settled. I looked at him. "I have my own car. I know." Then, "You parked on level 3 of the garage on Clement Street," he said quietly. "The elevator has been out of service since last Thursday, which means you've been taking the stairwell on the north side of the structure." He paused. "Alone. After 10 o'clock. The envelopes in my hands suddenly felt very light. All the noise from the reception seemed very far away. "How do you know where I parked?" He didn't answer that, and the fact that he didn't answer, the fact that he simply held my gaze with that steady, unruffled calm, told me more than any explanation could have. He knew because he had made it his business to know. The when and the how of that were details he saw no reason to provide. I should have been angry. Part of me was. But underneath the anger was something else. Something I didn't want to look at too directly, because it felt uncomfortably close to the awareness that someone had been paying attention to me, carefully, in a way no one had for a very long time. "I can manage a stairwell," I said, but my voice had lost some of its steadiness. "I'm sure you can." He straightened slightly and looked toward the corridor that led back to the main exit. "Walk with me anyway." The 5-second silence that followed was the longest I'd experienced in months. I thought about Priya's face. I thought about the man in the gray suit who'd walked away from that table, looking like he needed a moment to collect himself. I thought about the way the room had changed when Hakjin walked into it. Then I thought about a parking garage stairwell at 10:15 on a Tuesday night. "Just to the east entrance," I said. He started walking, not waiting for more of an answer than that. I followed, 3 steps behind, then 2, and then somehow beside him, the hallway opening back up toward the soft lights of the lobby, the last of the evening's guests filtering out through the main doors ahead of us, none of them looking our way. None of them except Priya, who was standing near the coat check with her wrap half over her shoulders, and who saw me walking alongside Hak Jin-yoon with an expression on her face that I could only describe as the specific alarm of someone watching a person they care about make a choice they don't fully understand yet. I kept walking. The east entrance of the Whitmore Grand opened onto a side street that most guests never used. There was a black car waiting exactly where he'd said there would be. A dark SUV, engine running, parked with the kind of precision that suggested the driver had been told not to move under any circumstances. One of the security detail was already at the door before we'd even reached the sidewalk. Not rushing. Just there, the way they were always simply there, as if they materialized from the edges of whatever space Hak Jin occupied. I stopped at the bottom of the hotel steps. "Thank you for the..." I started. "Clement Street is 7 blocks from here," Hak Jin said, without breaking stride. He stopped beside the car and looked back at me. "The driver will take you." "That's not necessary. It's 10:20. I'm aware of what time it is." He looked at me with that same expression that gave away nothing, and somehow communicated everything. One of the security men near the car shifted his weight slightly, and I had the irrational thought that every single person in Hak Jin's orbit had learned to exist in a state of absolute readiness, like instruments waiting to be played. "Mr. Yoon," I said, using his name formally because I needed something to hold on to. "I appreciate it. I do. But I don't know you, and getting into a car with someone I don't know isn't something I do." A pause. Short, but real. And something in his expression shifted, barely perceptible. Not frustration, and not offense either. Something more like a recalibration. "Then I'll walk with you," he said. I opened my mouth to decline that too, and then I thought about what exactly I was declining. An escort, at night, 7 blocks, from a man who, whatever else he was, had not been anything other than direct and composed since the moment I'd met him. I thought about the stairwell again. I thought about the fact that I'd been parking on level 3 for 6 weeks and had never once mentioned to anyone at the office that the elevator was broken because I didn't want to make a thing of it. "Fine," I said, before I could overthink it further. "But I'm walking." He said something brief to the driver in Korean. The driver nodded. The car stayed where it was. 2 of the security men fell into position, not close, not hovering, but present in that peripheral way I was already becoming familiar with. We walked. The street was quiet enough that our footsteps were audible on the sidewalk. The November air was sharp, the kind of cold that reminds you winter isn't waiting for permission. I still had the foundation envelopes tucked under my arm, which felt faintly absurd given the circumstances. For nearly half a block, neither of us said anything. I was waiting for him to say something, which I suspect he knew. He seemed entirely comfortable with silence. Wore it the way other people wore expensive clothing, like it was chosen deliberately. "How long has the elevator been broken?" he asked eventually. "Since the 14th. I paused. "Of last month. You reported it?" "To building management. They said it was on the repair schedule." He didn't respond to that, but I caught the slight change in his jaw, a tightening, brief and controlled, and filed it away without entirely understanding why. "You don't have to look like that," I said. "It's a parking garage, not a..." "A woman alone in a stairwell at night is a preventable situation," he said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a lecture. It was just a fact, stated plainly, the way someone states something they have believed for a long time. That's all. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and we walked another half block in silence. The city moved around us normally. A couple passed on the opposite sidewalk. A restaurant we went by was still full, warm light spilling out through the windows. The sound of music briefly audible as we passed the door. Ordinary Tuesday night Chicago. I felt oddly displaced from it, like I was observing it from outside a pane of glass. Priya told me people cross the street when your car is parked nearby, I said. I don't know why I said it. It came out before I'd fully decided to. He was quiet for a moment. Priya works in your office. Yes. How long has she known you? 3 years. Why? Because she warned you away from me before I'd said a word to you. He glanced at me sideways, briefly. That means she was watching, which means she was already concerned before tonight. I thought about that. Should I be concerned? He looked forward again. That depends on what you're concerned about. Which was not an answer. Or, it was an answer, just not to the question I'd asked. I was starting to understand that this was how he operated. Not evasion, exactly. More like precision. He said what he meant and declined to say what he didn't. The gaps were intentional. You gave a significant donation tonight, I said. Steering toward ground, I understood better. I saw your name on the commitments sheet before the event. The foundation is... I'm not interested in talking about the donation. I stopped walking. He stopped 2 steps later and turned to look at me. Then what are you interested in? I asked. My voice was steadier than I felt. Because you've walked 7 blocks out of your way, which I'm assuming is not something you do, and you haven't told me a single thing about yourself that I couldn't have found on a publicly available donor list. He studied me for a moment. The nearest streetlight was half a block back, so his face was mostly in shadow, but I could see his eyes, dark, steady, focused on me with an attention that felt like pressure without being unkind. You organized an event for 200 people, he said, managed 4 separate problems in the first hour alone, and at no point looked overwhelmed. But when I spoke to you at the registration table, you held that clipboard like it was the only solid thing in the room. He paused. I found that interesting. I stared at him. You were watching me that closely. Yes, just that. No apology, no elaboration. Yes. I turned and started walking again, mostly because I needed a moment where he couldn't see my face. My heart was doing something unreasonable, and I needed it to stop. We reached Clement Street 2 minutes later. I found my parking ticket in my bag automatically, the kind of task my hands did while my brain was occupied elsewhere. The garage entrance was lit, familiar, and I was, genuinely, measurably, relieved to see it. Not because I'd felt unsafe during those 7 blocks, but because proximity to Hak Jin-yoon had a quality to it I didn't have good language for yet. Something about the way he paid attention made the world around him feel more vivid and more weighted than normal. At the entrance to the garage, I turned to face him. Thank you, I said, for walking with me. He nodded once. North stairwell? I added, because apparently I was now narrating my own movements to a man I'd known for 3 hours. I know. I looked at him. You're going to stand here until I'm inside, aren't you? He didn't answer, but he also didn't move. I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him, and walked into the garage. My footsteps echoed. I counted 3 flights without thinking about it, pushed through the door to level 3, found my car where I'd left it, unlocked it, sat down. And then I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, hands on the wheel, staring at the concrete pillar in front of me. I didn't know what Hak Jin-yoon was. Not fully. Priya's warnings were vague in a way that felt deliberate, the way people are vague about things they think are too large to fully name. I knew he was from a powerful family. The name Yoon appeared on enough foundation materials that I'd absorbed it without meaning to. I knew he had security because powerful people had security. I knew that something about the way people behaved around him suggested the kind of authority that didn't come from a title on a business card. What I didn't know was why he'd spent an evening watching me reorganize a speaker's notes. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I stared at it. Then I answered, because I was apparently incapable of making the sensible decision tonight. The elevator repair is scheduled for Friday, Hakjin said. I made a call. Use the west stairwell until then. It's better lit. The line went quiet. How did you get this number? I asked. But he'd already ended the call. I sat in the concrete silence of level 3 and thought about the fact that Hakjin Yoon had, within the span of 40 minutes, arranged for an elevator repair and acquired my personal phone number. And that somehow, in the middle of all of that, the feeling sitting heaviest in my chest wasn't fear. It was something I was much less equipped to handle. I didn't tell anyone about the phone call. Not Priya, who spent the better part of Wednesday morning watching me from across the office with the careful attention of someone waiting for a confession. Not my sister Dana, who called that evening and somehow knew, the way she always did, that something had shifted. She said I sounded different, and I told her I was just tired from the gala, which was true enough to pass. Not anyone. I went back to work. I drafted donor acknowledgement letters. I reviewed budget projections for the spring fundraiser. I ate lunch at my desk on Thursday because the catering order for a board luncheon had come in wrong, and I spent 40 minutes on the phone with the vendor sorting it out. Normal. Routine. The week moved the way weeks were supposed to move, forward and without ceremony. The elevator on Clement Street was repaired on Friday morning. I know because I used it. I stood in that small, humming box as it carried me up to level 3, and I thought about the fact that one phone call, from a man I had spoken to for a combined total of maybe 20 minutes, had accomplished something that 6 weeks of building management tickets had not. And I didn't know how to hold that. It wasn't a gift, exactly. It didn't feel like one. It felt more like a demonstration. Quiet, efficient, and pointed. I tried not to think about it too much. I mostly failed. The following Tuesday, I was at the foundation office late. Everyone else had gone home by 7. I was working through a grant application that needed to go out by end of week, sitting at my desk with a cold cup of coffee and a spreadsheet that kept throwing errors I couldn't locate. The office was one of those older Chicago buildings where the heating worked inconsistently, and the windows let in a draft if the wind was coming from the east, which it was that night. So I had my jacket on over my work clothes, and a scarf looped around my neck even indoors, which is the kind of detail that's embarrassing in retrospect. The lobby buzzer went off at 7:43. I almost didn't answer it. We had a night security guard on the building's ground floor, and late deliveries weren't unusual. But the guard's voice through the intercom sounded careful in a way that made me set down my pen. Ms. Reyes, there's a pause, the kind that means someone is standing right there. Visitor here for you. I went downstairs. Hakjin was standing in the lobby with one of his security detail positioned near the entrance. He was in a dark coat this time, open at the front, and he looked entirely out of place in the worn, fluorescent-lit lobby of a non-profit office building in a way that he seemed completely unbothered by. The security guard, a retired cop named Harold who had worked in this building for 11 years and was not easily impressed by anything, was standing with his hands behind his back, and an expression that suggested he had made a rapid and significant reassessment of his evening. "Mr. Yoon," I said. The fact that I used his name without thinking about it registered somewhere at the back of my mind. I wasn't expecting. There's a situation with one of your board members, he said. No preamble. Gerald Marsh. He signed something he shouldn't have. It involves a contractor the foundation has been working with for the last 2 years. He reached into his coat and removed a folded document which he held out to me. You need to see this before it becomes a problem you can't manage. I didn't take it immediately. How do you know about our contractors? Take it, Isabella. The use of my name, the first time he'd used it, I realized, landed differently than I expected. Not loudly. Just specifically. I took the document. It took me 4 minutes to read it, standing in that lobby under the fluorescent lights with Harold pretending not to watch from his desk. By the time I reached the third page, I understood what I was looking at, and the coffee I'd been drinking for the last 2 hours turned cold in my stomach in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The contractor, a facilities management company the foundation had used for venue and equipment rentals, had been inflating invoices for 18 months. The document in my hands was a financial audit summary, detailed and annotated, with Gerald Marsh's signature on an approval form that either meant he had no idea what he was signing or that he was very aware of exactly what he was signing. "Where did you get this?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. "That doesn't matter right now. It matters to me." He looked at me steadily. "Someone brought it to my attention because they knew I had a connection to the foundation. I'm bringing it to you because you're the one who will handle it correctly." I looked up from the document. "Why are you certain of that?" "Because you've been fixing other people's oversight since you walked into that event last Tuesday," he said. Quietly, without recognition. "That's not something you learned in nonprofit development." I thought about the hospital. The years I'd spent in administrative roles where the problems were always larger than the job description, where covering for other people's failures was simply part of the work, unnamed and uncompensated. I thought about why I'd left. "If this goes to the board," I said slowly, "Gerald could lose his position. The foundation could lose its standing with several major donors. The contractor will lawyer up immediately." I looked at the document again. "This is not a small thing." "No," Hakjin agreed. "It isn't. And you brought it to me, not to Gerald, not to the board chair, not to a lawyer." "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the avoidant quiet of someone who doesn't want to answer. The considered quiet of someone choosing exactly how to. "Because Gerald will protect himself first," he said. "The board chair will panic and make it worse. And a lawyer will take 6 months to do what you could do in 2 weeks if you had the information." He paused. "You needed the information." I stood there holding a document that had the potential to unravel 2 years of the foundation's work, in a drafty lobby at nearly 8 o'clock at night, and thought about the fact that a man I had met 7 days ago had apparently formed a detailed enough opinion of my competence to decide I was the right person to handle this. It should have felt presumptuous. Parts of it did. But he wasn't wrong about any of it, and I was tired enough and practical enough to know that. "I'll need to verify this independently," I said. I expected that. "And I'll need to speak with our legal counsel before I do anything else." Also expected. "And you cannot be involved in whatever comes next. If your name is attached to this in any way, it complicates everything." Something in his expression shifted, barely. "Understood." I folded the document carefully and held it at my side. Harold was still very busy looking at something on his desk. The security guard near the entrance was a statue. "Why do you donate to the foundation?" I asked. It wasn't what I'd meant to say. It came out sideways, the way questions do when you're really asking something else. Hakjin looked at me for a moment. "My sister was a patient at the Children's Hospital 17 years ago. She was 9. He said it plainly, without ceremony, the way someone states something that is simply true and has been true for a long time. She recovered. Not everyone does. I held that quietly for a second. The family from last week's program, the daughter, the parents' steady voices, moved through my mind briefly. "I'm sorry," I said, "that she went through that." He nodded once. Just once. The draft from the east window moved through the lobby, and Harold's desk lamp flickered briefly, and the moment passed. "You should go home," Hakjin said. It wasn't dismissive. It had the same quality as everything else he said. Practical, direct, and underneath it, something that felt almost like concern, though I wasn't sure I was reading that correctly. "It's late." "So should you," I said, which was probably the least appropriate response to whatever this interaction had been. Something moved at the corner of his expression. That, almost not quite a smile again. "My car is outside," he said. "The driver will—" "I have my car," I said. "The elevator works now." He held my gaze for a moment. "It does." I walked toward the elevator, pressed the button, waited. "Hakjin." I said his name before I'd decided to. He was halfway to the door. He stopped, didn't turn immediately. "Thank you. For this." I held up the document slightly. "For bringing it to me." He turned then, just enough to look back at me over his shoulder. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Read it again when you're not standing under fluorescent lights. The third attachment is the part that matters." The elevator arrived. I stepped in. And as the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of Harold at his desk, watching the lobby entrance where Hakjin had just walked out, wearing the expression of a man who had decided that whatever he'd just witnessed was something he would be thinking about for quite some time. I understood the feeling completely. The third attachment was a name. Not a company, not an invoice number. A name. Typed at the bottom of an internal memo between the contractor's billing department and someone listed only as a liaison. A name I recognized because it appeared on the Foundation's own organizational chart, 2 positions below Gerald Marsh, in a role I had always considered administrative and unremarkable. David Holt, our operations coordinator. 34 years old, had worked at the Foundation for 4 years, brought coffee to board meetings, and managed the vendor contact list, and was so thoroughly background that I could not, sitting at my kitchen table at 10:30 that night, recall a single conversation I'd had with him that lasted longer than 2 minutes. I read the third attachment 4 times. Then I called our legal counsel's emergency line, apologized for the hour, and read her the relevant sections. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, "Isabella, how did you get this?" And I said I'd explain everything in the morning, and she said, "Be in my office at 8. And that was that. I didn't sleep well. Not because I was frightened, exactly. More because my mind wouldn't stop moving through it, turning the pieces over, looking at them from different angles the way you do when something doesn't fully resolve. I kept coming back to Hakjin, to the fact that he had known, that somewhere in the overlap between his world and ours, this information had surfaced, and he had made a choice about what to do with it. He had chosen me. I didn't know what that meant. I wasn't sure I was ready to. The next 2 weeks were the most professionally demanding of my life. Legal counsel moved quickly once she had the documents. An independent audit was commissioned. David Holt resigned on a Thursday afternoon before anyone had formally confronted him, which told its own story. Gerald Marsh was placed on administrative leave while the board conducted its review. That part was harder, because Gerald had built the Foundation over many years, and there were people there who genuinely believed the best of him, and watching that belief collide with evidence was not easy to be near. I managed the internal communications. I coordinated with the auditors. I answered the board's questions as honestly and completely as I could, every time, without editorializing. I did my job. Through all of it, I didn't hear from Hakjin. Not a call, not a message. Nothing. He had placed that document in my hands, and then simply withdrawn, exactly as I'd asked him to. No involvement, no attached name, no complication. I had asked for that, and he had honored it completely, and I told myself I was grateful for it, which was true. It was also not the whole truth. On a Wednesday evening in late November, 3 weeks after the gala, I was leaving the office, through the lobby with the working elevator, which still gave me a small, complicated feeling every time I used it, when I pushed through the front door and stopped. Hakjin's car was parked across the street. Not directly in front of the building. Half a block down, dark, unremarkable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But I was, apparently, looking for it. I recognized the plates without meaning to. I crossed the street. The window came down before I reached it. Hakjin was in the back seat, a folder open on his knee, a pen in his hand. He looked up at me the way someone looks up when they were expecting you, which meant he had seen me come out of the building, which meant he had been waiting. "You could have just called," I said. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." That surprised me. Not the words themselves, but the fact that he said them. Something candid and almost unguarded, so different from the precise, contained way he usually spoke that I didn't have an immediate response ready. I stood there on the sidewalk in the November cold, my bag over my shoulder, looking at him through the open window. "The board voted to bring in an interim director," I said, "while they complete the review. They asked me to oversee donor communications through the transition." I paused. I said yes. He nodded slowly. "That's the right call. It's also 3 times the work for the same pay, so..." I shifted my bag. "But yes, probably the right call. Something that was almost in a smile. You'll manage it. I know I will." I looked at him. "How did you get that audit summary, Hakjin? And don't tell me it doesn't matter." He was quiet for a moment. The pen in his hand turned once, a slow, deliberate rotation. "The contractor had outstanding obligations to people I know. When their internal communications became relevant to those obligations, I became aware of them." He met my eyes. "That's as much as I can tell you." I thought about what that meant, what it implied about the kind of people he knew, the kind of obligations he was referring to, the world that ran underneath this one, parallel, connected at certain points, surfacing only when it chose to. I had known, in some abstract way, since Priya's warning, that Hakjin Yoon operated in spaces I didn't have clear visibility into. Standing here on a November sidewalk, I felt the edges of that more concretely than I had before. "Are you dangerous?" I asked. Directly, the way he would have asked it. He didn't look away. "To some people, yes. To me..." The pause before he answered was the most important pause I'd experienced in a long time. "No," he said. Quietly, but with a certainty that didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a fact he had already decided, and decided completely. I believed him. I wasn't entirely sure I should, and I believed him anyway, which told me something about where I was standing in relation to the situation that I probably needed to examine more carefully at some point. "You've been watching out for me," I said. Not accusing, just naming it. "Since the gala, not just the elevator, you've been keeping track of things." He didn't confirm it. He also didn't deny it. "That's not something I agreed to," I said. "I know. And it's not something you asked permission for." "No." I looked at him for a long moment. The street was quiet around us. Somewhere down the block, a restaurant door opened and released a brief wave of warmth and noise before closing again. "I don't know what to do with you," I said finally. It came out more honest than I intended. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here?" He closed the folder on his knee, set the pen down, looked at me with that focused, steady attention that I had spent 3 weeks trying to accurately describe to myself without success. "I wanted to know that you were all right," he said. "After everything with the foundation." It was a significant amount of pressure. 3 weeks of professional crisis, of 14-hour days and difficult conversations and holding together an organization that was quietly coming apart at one of its seams. And this man had been out here, in the dark, on a Wednesday evening, wanting to know if I was all right. I didn't know what to do with that. I genuinely didn't. "I'm all right," I said. My voice was steady, tired, but all right. He nodded. And then, because he was Hakjin, and he did nothing without intention, he reached into the folder and removed a small card, which he held out through the window. A phone number, handwritten. Not his, a different number, with a name above it. A therapist, I realized reading it. Someone who specialized in workplace crisis and professional burnout. "She's good," he said simply, "if you want to talk to someone who isn't involved." I took the card, looked at it, looked at him. "You're a very strange person," I said. "I've been told." I closed my hand around the card. The cold was settling into my shoulders now, and I should have been getting to my car. And I stood there for another moment anyway. "I'm going to go home," I said. "Eat something real for the first time in 4 days and sleep more than 5 hours. Good. And I'm going to think," I added carefully, "about whether I want to continue having a whatever this is with someone I still know very little about." He held my gaze. "That's fair. It might take me a while." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Not possessively, just plainly. A statement of position, the same way everything else he said was a statement of position. I stepped back from the car. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't say anything else. He just watched me the way he always watched me, with that complete, unhurried attention that I had stopped trying to deflect and started trying to understand. I walked back across the street, through the door, into the elevator that worked now, that had worked for 3 weeks, because someone had made a phone call on a Friday morning and said, "Make it a priority." On the 3rd floor, I sat in my car and opened my hand and looked at the card. The thing I understood, sitting there, was that I had not arrived at this moment because I was naive, or because I had been careless. I had arrived here because I had done my job, and someone had noticed. And the someone who noticed was not simple or safe or easy to categorize. And maybe I didn't need him to be. Maybe I just needed to be honest with myself about what I actually knew, which was that this man had, without announcement or expectation, stood quietly at the edges of a very difficult 3 weeks and made sure I had what I needed. I didn't know yet what I would do with that, but I knew I wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened. I started my car, pulled out of level 3, took the exit onto Clement Street and turned toward home. And somewhere behind me, I knew without looking, a dark car waited until I'd made the turn before it moved. I had stopped being unsettled by that. That, in itself, was probably the most significant thing I could have told anyone about where I stood.